We get a lot of questions about wheat fertility each year. Usually it's, how do I make my protein levels better? Well, that's real simple. Have more available nitrogen later on in the season.
That's simple to say, Brian, not always simple to accomplish.
I realize that, but still the answer is actually pretty simple. If you want higher protein, you got to have more nitrogen late in the season. How can you get that? You can get it by having higher organic matter levels. You can get it by putting on more nitrogen, like stream barring, later in the year especially. And you can get it by using nitrogen stabilizers, so your nitrogen doesn't all release at once and get turned into the nitrate form. You'll hold it in the ammonium form longer, keep it up in your topsoil a little longer, but you've got to have N late in the season.
All right, the other things with protein, we have to have adequate levels of sulfur. This is one that is getting left out in a lot of programs. We'll talk about sulfur a little bit.
Yeah, let's talk about it right now.
And also micronutrients. Those things are key when we're talking about protein.
Okay, but with sulfur, did you know that a 100 bushel wheat crop's going to remove roughly 25 pounds of sulfur? I mean, granted, some of that's going to stay in the residue and stay in the field if you leave the residue out there, but there's a certain amount of that absolutely is leaving the field when the grain leaves. You need some sulfur every year because sulfur, just like nitrate, is leachable. It's not going to stick around. If you get decent rains during the year, your sulfur is probably gone. So every year you should be applying some sulfur. Now, not all of them.
The same is true with micronutrients,
Well,
Brian.
not all of them, though.
You need some micros out there every year, and typically what we're doing is using a blended product that's blended for wheat application that has a number of different micros in it, because it's really hard if you say, I need some copper, or I need some zinc, or I need some manganese. It's hard to get 1 pound or less spread evenly across a field. So a lot of times we're using a blended product like this, and we've seen some really good gains and a really nice return on investment.
And it only costs
pretty
5
consistently.
Or 10. Yeah, it only costs $5 or $10 an acre, so it's almost nothing, depending on your yield goal, $5 or $10.
All right, so we've talked a lot about protein. Let's talk about yield, because protein is one component, but yield is another thing, and it's not just the nitrogen that's holding yield back. I have a lot of guys that say, well, my wheat yields are disappointing. I guess I needed to put on more nitrogen. Not necessarily. P and K are a really big deal in wheat.
But what we encourage you to do is do good soil tests and then do some plant tissue tests too. Sample every week from when your wheat comes up until you get late in the season. Every week, just take 1 or 2 fields, test in the best area and test in the worst area, and send those samples in every week. It's not going to cost you much money, but you're going to have so much information. And what we find is probably what you're going to find too. On a lot of fields, we see that farmers are lacking in potassium and phosphorus, just like Darren is saying. What we want you to do is download the free Ag PhD fertilizer removal app. Then you can punch in any crop you've got, any yield goal you've got, and you'll see exactly what it removes. I'll tell you right now, if you've got 100 bushel spring wheat, you're going to remove roughly 75 pounds of phosphorus or phosphate and 150 pounds of K2O potassium. Again, a bunch of that's going to stay in the field with the stover, but still, you got to have that much to raise a 100 bushel crop. That's a lot of fertility. You've got to make sure your soil has that.
Well, it certainly is. And when we're thinking about 2-year fertility programs and guys that say, well, I'm going to put on this much fertility this year and that'll hold me over for a couple of years, think again. Those programs are out of date.
Well, no, wait a second. It might if you're putting enough on. We just need you to make sure that you're fertilizing appropriately for 2 years worth of crop if you're doing a 2-year fertilizer program.
You've got to do some tissue analysis just to verify what's actually getting into the plant, because I hear a lot of guys in wheat growing areas that say, well, my soil test said my parts per million on potassium were really pretty good, so I should be able to cut back, right? Well, there's more than just parts per million. I think that a better reading is really the base saturation on your soil test, so you can see where that potassium is in ratio to other nutrients like calcium and magnesium, for example. If you have high levels of calcium and magnesium in your soil, chances are you may not have enough potassium that's available for your crop.
Well, you've got to have 4 to 8% potassium in that base saturation test. That's what we're looking for on the soil test. I mean, there's a lot we can talk about with wheat fertility, but again, we want you to download that free Ag PhD fertilizer removal app for your smartphone or your iPad, so then you can run your own numbers yourself. It's a free app, by the way. We just put it out there so you have good information so you can make the right decisions for your farm going into next year.
Well, fortunately, one thing that normally isn't a huge problem in wheat production is our Weed of the Week. We'll show you how to stop it coming up next.